Welcome to the Danube Institute. Annabelle, you and Tom come right up here. We've saved some seats on the front row just for you. Welcome. On behalf of my colleagues, Noemi Karani, Executive Director, John O'Sullivan, who at this moment is on a plane heading to another conference in New York, I'd like to welcome you. I see many people who were here this morning for the conference. Thank you so much for doing double duty. We're here tonight to discuss the midterm elections, and as someone who voted in them, I know that many of us had a very keen interest in it, and here to break it down and give us maybe a little bit of reading of the tea leaves is John Fund, who is a dear friend and also a brilliant analysis of things political. He works with my husband at National Review magazine, which is the major conservative magazine in the U.S. He's also a contributor to Fox News, so you may have seen him doing his bit there. And he will be guided this evening in the discussion by Dr. Gergely Vargas, Senior Research Fellow at the Institute for Foreign Affairs. And at this point, you have the bios in front of you. I'm not going to read them. You read them at your leisure, and I'm turning the program over to Dr. Varga.
Thank you very much. So I would also like to give a very warm welcome to our guest tonight, Mr. John Fund, and also a warm welcome for all those who arrived here to be with us this evening. I'm sure that we will have really thought-provoking and highly interesting talk, and maybe later a debate about the midterm, but not just the midterm, but also stepping back 2 steps and maybe a little bit evaluating where is American conservatism heading, where is it today, to give a little bit of historical perspective of the main questions and challenges within the American conservative movement. And I'm convinced that we would have an excellent, we will be given excellent introductory remarks and thought-provoking remarks by Mr. John Fund this evening. So with this, I would first give the floor to our guest.
Thank you. Well, it is a pleasure to be here. I have been a big fan of Hungary since I first visited in 1989. Times were different. That was a year that Hungarians, of course, remember very well. And I was honored, actually, in 2006 to be the keynote speaker at the 50th anniversary of the commemoration of the revolution in Hungary by the Hungarian community of Cleveland. And that was one of the signal honors that I can remember in my career. I'm also very pleased to be here because my good friend Michael Gonzalez, former colleague of mine at the Wall Street Journal and now with the Heritage Foundation, is here. Michael and I have developed a little cottage industry, which is after the elections we fly around the world trying to explain what happened. My career as a Trump whisperer, or a Trump explainer, I should say, began because I live in New York, and I've known Donald Trump for 29 years. So I'm happy to answer questions. I'm not a good friend of his. I'm not a strong enemy of his. On the other hand, for brief periods of time, I've been both. But they don't last, because the most enduring thing about Donald Trump is if you like something he's doing, wait 5 minutes, and if you don't like something he's doing, wait 5 minutes. So Michael and I, Michael is speaking here and also in Guatemala. I go from here to Vienna to speak twice on this subject and also do an informal talk in Switzerland. So Mike, we've got a sideline going. And I know, I think, we're going to keep this going, explaining Trump to the world. Now, I'm going to give you some warning. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the election in my talk. I'm going to leave that to the question and answer. So there may be dry patches in my talk where you're wondering, where is this all going? Be patient, I'll explain it. And at the end, I'll be happy to take your questions, and if you want to ask specific questions about specific races or issues and how they played out in the election or the 2020 campaign, I'm happy to deal with that. But the talk itself is more philosophical. It's going to be about the role that populism, which is a subject that Hungarians are very familiar with in their own politics, the role that populism is now playing in American politics. Now, because I wanted to be careful, and because obviously the Danube Institute is scholarly, I have prepared remarks. I don't normally do this. I normally am a more spontaneous speaker, so I'm going to be reading my text largely. And I apologize because I would love to be looking at you directly, and instead, unfortunately, you're going to be seeing me look down at a piece of paper, which I know is not the most amenable form of communication, but I wanted to get down clearly what I have to say. So with that, and I apologize again for not standing because obviously it's not a podium. So we'll get going. Of all of the strange and remarkable features of politics in the era of Trump, among the least strange and the least remarkable is the alliance that has emerged between conservatism and populism. It seems strange and remarkable because it reflects a certain disconnection from our own traditions in America. The uncertainty and agitation that the alliance introduced into conservative ranks underscores the importance of recovering a lively appreciation of conservatism's origins in the United States, its major ideas, and its perennial task. So we're going to have a little bit of a history lesson, but it'll go down easy. I don't mean to deny the improbability of Donald Trump having made himself the tribune of conservative hopes and popular anxieties. Nor do I wish to discount the marvel, 21 months into his presidency, of strong economic growth, of historically low unemployment, notably for African Americans, Latinos, and women, and of a Supreme Court which for the first time since World War II has a majority devoted to interpreting the Constitution as it was written rather than as some wish it to be. For a brash billionaire Manhattan real estate developer, for a long-running reality TV star, for a Playboy celebrity who over the course of decades was a leading Democratic campaign donor, hobnobbed with Democratic Party royalty, had Hillary and Bill Clinton come to his wedding and toast him, and contributed substantially to all of their campaigns. For all that and more, Donald Trump's political accomplishments are truly strange and remarkable. And the overword used, unique, could even be used. But Trump did not invent the alliance between conservatism and populism, or to speak less polemically, between conservatism and the people. Far from it. Trump rode the wave of a populist revolt sweeping across the world. In liberal democracy after liberal democracy, politicians like him have made common cause with a disaffected portion of the working class and a perturbed segment of the middle class. A recurring complaint reverberates among non-urban Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Iowa voters. Similar grievances engage large parts of the United Kingdom, France, Germany, Italy, Hungary, Poland, Israel, Brazil, which just elected the Trump of the tropics, Colonel Bolsonaro. An imperious ruling elite, say many people in many countries, has imposed laws, cultural norms, social practices that radiate disdain for the people's belief and endangers a traditional middle-class life. From this perspective, elites have conspired across the aisle to promote globalization, free trade, and mass immigration to benefit themselves while ignoring the cost to the less educated and the less wealthy. Meanwhile, many conservative members of the political intellectual elite believe that progressive elites who dominate the media, social media, the entertainment industry, the academy, despise conservatives. The scorched earth tactics unsuccessfully employed to stop the nomination of Judge Brett Kavanaugh for the Supreme Court confirmed a sense shared by conservatives everywhere. That sense is that they are now bound together by a common political opponent that has no boundaries in what it will do. Notwithstanding the virulence of today's politics and the strange bedfellows it's produced, the Trump coalition represents a new variation on an old historical theme. In fact, the alliance between conservatism and the people, between those devoted to preserving and the people who want their communities to be preserved, this alliance is as old as modern conservatism itself. Its roots can be traced to British statesman Edmund Burke, whose critique of the French Revolution argued against radical change. Around 150 years later, the founders of the conservative movement in America, especially that associated with William F. Buckley, Jr., and National Review magazine, this conservatism renewed the relationship between the conservative movement and the people. The alliance has driven American conservatism's rise over the last 70 years to its current political prominence. Not the least practical benefit of such understanding is its capacity to calm nerves, steady gazes, firm up spines, and cool judgment. The conservative challenge in the era of Trump means we have to figure out a way to integrate these new views into the conservative movement. So, if we go back through Edmund Burke, I'm going to shorten the Edmund Burke segment here. Like the modern conservatism that Edmund Burke inaugurated in the 1780s, the conservative movement in America was forged in response to a crisis, really a pair of crises. Classical liberals and traditionalists, the two parts of modern American conservatism, had their differences. Classical liberals sought to conserve limited government and the ideas that underwrote it. Traditionalists strove to conserve traditional morality and the local communities that embodied it. Yet in the 1940s and the 1950s, both classical liberals and traditionalists agreed that the tremendous growth of government engineered by Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal and the expansionist communist totalitarianism, which Hungary and other countries suffered from, presented profound new threats to freedom. In the mid-1940s, London School of Economics professor Friedrich Hayek published a classic statement, The Road to Serfdom, a surprise bestseller in the United States and in other countries, which examined the despotic ambitions of modern planners. These intellectuals and technocrats, spiritual descendants of the French revolutionaries, favored, quote, a central direction of all economic activity according to a single plan, whether it be 5 years, 1 year, 10 years, or a lifetime. Curtailing economic freedom, Hayek warned, would subvert all freedoms. Now, classical liberals are not known for their populist tendencies. Yet the modern tradition of freedom that Hayek undertook to preserve leaves the people to their own devices, to their own common sense, able to make their own decisions about where they work, what they produce, what they consume, how they raise their families. The protection of economic freedom, Hayek emphasized, established a sturdy fence around political and religious freedom. From the other side of the conservative movement, in the early 1950s, Russell Kirk reconstructed a tradition of thought that focused on conserving traditional morality. Like Hayek's classical liberalism, Kirk did not create his traditionalism from the people. Yet also like classical liberalism, traditionalism shielded the people from elites bent on rescuing the people from themselves and their outdated ideas. Out of, quote, affection for the proliferating variety and mystery of traditional life, unquote, and in opposition to, quote, the narrowing uniformity and egalitarianism and utilitarian aims of most radical systems, unquote, Kirk condemned the ambition of progressive elites to impose a moral orthodoxy. Despite their shared opposition to collectivism, classical liberalism and traditionalism, the partisans of freedom and the partisans of tradition, often clashed. The enthusiasm that some traditionalists demonstrated for legislating their morality offended classical liberals. And of course, the 1960s changed many of those debates in the United States and also in Europe. And the indifference some classical liberals displayed to the moral foundations of free societies scandalized traditionalists like Kirk. With the founding of National Review in 1955, William F. Buckley set out to unite the conservative factions. This is called fusionism, to unite the partisans of freedom and the partisans of tradition. In part, Buckley responded to a practical imperative. In the mid-1950s, any viable conservative majority in the United States had to have both classical liberals and traditionalists as part of its coalition. The same remains true today. We have a two-party system in America because, as you know, we're the only major country, in fact, the only country that has our system. The traditional system for democracies is a parliamentary democracy or parliamentary republic, where you have coalitions forming a government which is often never able to secure a majority, for any one party. So a bunch of parties get together and form a coalition. They elect a prime minister, and the government results from that. We have a mixed system. We have a separation of powers into legislative, executive, and judicial branches. We have an elected president, but he's circumscribed by a separately elected Congress. We also have many layers of local administrators and officials in our federalist system. And as a result of a variety of historical accidents, we have a two-party system effectively. The other parties are extremely minor. And as a result, you basically have to achieve a majority or a near majority, both in electing a Congress and electing a president. This necessitates a really broad coalition. You can't stitch together a coalition from 3 or 4 parties. You have to do it within one major party. As a result, each party is going to have to assemble a coalition that has enough in common that people will vote for it, but fully recognize that it includes an awful lot of people that each member of that coalition would not invite home for dinner. And in fact, if you did invite them home for dinner, there'd be a big argument and you might break up your coalition, which is why it's often very good that members of the coalitions in the Republican and Democratic parties often don't get together a lot and talk to each other, because they might discover their differences are more important than their similarities. For Buckley, the marriage between classical liberals and traditionalists was no more a marriage of convenience. It improved both partners. Limited government, Buckley believed, promoted traditional morality, and traditional morality, he maintained, taught the virtues of freedom. Like classical liberals and traditionalists, Buckley emphasized the threat to the people posed by progressive elites. The mission statement of National Review proclaimed, quote, "The profound crisis of our age is in essence the conflict between the social engineers, the descendants of the French revolutionaries, who seek to adjust mankind to conform with a scientific utopia, and the disciples of truth who defend the organic moral order." For Buckley, the people, the average person in every country, embodied this organic moral order. 30 years later, Irving Kristol endorsed what he called the new populism. In a 1985 Wall Street Journal column, Kristol observed the distrust of populism was inscribed in America's founding. The Constitution, after all, established a limited government through complex institutional arrangements that I just described. To that end, the sovereign people rule indirectly under the Constitution and at a distance through elected representatives. Since the nation's founding, Kristol asserted, quote, "Populism has not had a good name among American political scientists, judges, or social critics," unquote. Associated with demagoguery, populists have taken to signify a movement of popular passions to overwhelm the political and legal process by which our republic has traditionally operated. But a new populism arose in the mid-1960s, argued Irving Kristol. The people, he contended, were justly dismayed by government's inept conduct of the Vietnam War, by courts that were intruding into daily social life, by schools that were abandoning the education and discipline of students, and by a criminal justice system that was losing interest in stopping crime. Consequently, said Kristol, quote, "The common sense, not the passion, but the common sense of the American people has been outraged over the past 20 years by the persistent unwisdom of their elected elites and appointed elite officials," unquote. The new populism differed greatly from, indeed, it was nearly the opposite of the blind rebellion against good constitutional government that was feared by America's founders. The new populism is rather an effort to bring our governing elites to their senses. For that reason, Kristol observed, quote, "So many people who would ordinarily worry about a populist upsurge find themselves sympathetic to the new populism." In other words, populism started to gain a good reputation and a good name in America because of the excesses of the progressive elites. That was 1985. Conservatism's political prospects have risen and fallen with the new populism. In 1980, Ronald Reagan owed his presidency in part to blue-collar Democrats and an energized religious right. George H.W. Bush lost his bid for a second term because 19% of voters voted for populist upstart Ross Perot after Bush broke his "read my lips, no new taxes" pledge. In 1994, Newt Gingrich's contract with America led to the first Republican majority in the House in 40 years. In 2000, George W. Bush won, in no small measure because left-wing populist Ralph Nader took a lot of votes from Al Gore. Tea Party energy fueled a stunning turnaround for the Republican Party in 2010, producing a majority in the House of Representatives that ended Barack Obama's plans for fundamentally transforming the United States of America, which was one of Barack Obama's campaign promises. And in 2016, Donald Trump defied the experts with a promise to make America great again that resonated with disillusioned swing voters. Since Burke, conservative elites have regularly joined forces with the people against progressive elites armed with transformative projects. Recognizing the historical continuities is crucial, not least to grasping how today's conservative populist coalition is different from other coalitions, but also because Trump himself is different. Recall in 1790 that Edmund Burke regarded British morality, civil society, and political institutions as fundamentally sound, as healthy. He sought to protect them from hateful French ideas. In 1955, William F. Buckley strove to safeguard entwined commitments to freedom and faith that he believed to be alive and well among ordinary people in their communities. In 1985, Irving Kristol found a repository of good judgment in the people and saw their decency as a bulwark against progressive overreach. But today, the people are restive and in distress. The danger to their communities is not distant and vague. It is not lurking on the outskirts. It has breached the town walls. It has occupied their neighborhoods and infiltrated their homes. The social critic Charles Murray has written that the multifaceted crisis that is assailing America's lower middle class has resulted in plunging marriage rates, rising births to unwed mothers, erosion of men's industriousness, surging crime, and a steep decline of religious faith. Add to that the disruptions visited upon the nation's industrial heartland by globalization, workplace automation, and opioids. Then there are the problems of racism, sexism, xenophobia that progressive elites heap on ordinary people to try to make them feel guilty, ashamed of their background, and basically forcing them to sit down and shut up, to not participate in public life because, gasp, they are deplorable. Witness Hillary Clinton's infamous line. Social media spreads these diseases like wildfire. This intensifies ordinary people's resentment and distrust if they're not racist, sexist, xenophobic, which of course the vast majority of Americans are not. Preserving and reforming no longer suffice. To conserve, one must also restore. The challenge is formidable. It calls for care and boldness, broad learning, and shrewd judgment. To restore America's lower middle class communities, conservative elites must persuade the people that individual freedom, limited government, free markets, civil society, and a strong America abroad advance the average person's long-term interests. Also, conservative elites must listen more and more carefully to the people that are better to understand their aspirations, their discontents, and their fears. This will aid in developing policies informed by the principles of constitutional government that address the people's immediate priorities, starting with good jobs, which are essential to healthy communities. We all recall the famous aphorism, "The devil's work is done by those who are idle." To fashion sound policy, liberal democracy in America must be well understood. A proper liberal education yields that understanding. However, few of our universities of higher education, either in Hungary or in the US, transmit knowledge of and cultivate the spirit of freedom. Rather, our colleges and universities all too often inculcate the practices and spirit of the tribalism and the identity politics that disfigure our cultures. After all, after national security and economic prosperity, what could be more important to the public interest than a truly liberal education, in the best sense of the word, one that prepares students to conserve the advantages of liberal democracy in America or in Hungary, and to undertake reforms to bring it more in line with its finest principles and most exemplary promises. Indeed, without such an education, how will citizens fully comprehend the imperatives of national security and economic prosperity? Now, it is true that liberal education has often been the province of elites. It is also true that, beginning with Edmund Burke, conservative elites have brought their learning to bear on behalf of the interests they share with the people in conserving freedom, including the freedom to conserve local communities and national tradition. In this strange and remarkable political moment that we find ourselves in the United States, lively appreciation of modern conservatism's origins, the differences between conservatism in Europe and conservatism in the United States, major ideas give us a perennial task that furnishes us with an invaluable resource for understanding how our politics are now working and how we can make them relevant to the daily, immediate lives of people and to advance the public interest, not only in America, but in other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these great introductory thoughts. As an initial kickstart for our questions and discussion, I would like to shortly reflect on populism, on today's populism. One of the criticism, what we hear, especially from the liberal media and also from some Democrats, is that in substance, on many policy issues, President Trump didn't really bring substantive changes. And we can bring up, for instance, the new trade agreement for North America, which had only some minor changes in comparison to the previous NAFTA agreement, or we can bring up the President Trump's stance on healthcare, for instance. So my question is President Trump's populism, is it more so of a communication strategy, or is it really a substantive change, a substantive policy change in reflecting to the previous Obama administration, or also in comparison to the traditional Republican agenda of the past 20, 25 years?
Well, let me challenge a small part of your premise. On the trade agreement between Mexico, the United States, and Canada, all you have to do is read the Mexican media and the Canadian media. No one there thinks that it was only minor changes in that agreement. They fought bitterly hard for 20 months for a reason. They didn't want any change. I think that the basic framework of the agreement replicates NAFTA, but there are many adjustments because after 25 years of a trade agreement, the world has changed. So you had to have adjustments in everything from robotics to dairy subsidies. And the changes are not dramatic, but they're significant, and it's a 1,200-page agreement. You don't make 1,200-page agreements if you're changing very little. Donald Trump's populism bumps up against traditional conservatism in one very important way. He's not interested in cutting spending overall. He's just not. If you talk about shrinking the state, he does want to shrink the administrative state, which is the part of the unelected bureaucracy that has seized control either through complicity or silent coup d'etat from Congress and writes its own rules and regulations without having elected authority. He certainly wants to deregulate, but cutting spending, he pretty much has promised entitlement spending is not a top priority, not a medium priority. It's a priority for someone after he leaves office. And that's sad. I agree entitlements have to be addressed, but entitlements are, well, you know, there's a saying about how to change the tax system in the United States. The motto is, don't cut me, don't cut thee, cut that fellow behind the tree. And that also goes for entitlement spending. It's somebody else's problem, and don't touch my entitlements. And the whole notion of entitlements has been very pernicious both in Europe and in the United States. The notion is that these systems are constructed so that people pay into them, so they feel ownership in them. But in reality, the recipients of these programs derive far more benefits than whatever money they pay into Social Security or Medicare. So it's the illusion that these are owned accounts, that these are accounts that represent your money, and you're getting back your money at a later point in your life, or when you're sick. This is a problem because, you know, as Margaret Thatcher said, Socialized programs work very, very well until you run out of other people's money. And in all of the democracies that I mentioned where these tensions exist, we're about to run out of other people's money. But in the broader sense, I'll tell you the two things that have surprised me about Donald Trump. I thought he would be more presidential in office. I thought there would be fewer tweets, less angry tweets. I thought there would be fewer, the wonder dog insult, behavior. I thought that there would be less frenzied diplomacy conducted over the airwaves with foreign leaders. That's not Donald Trump. Impulse is his middle name. I also thought, and I was wrong, that he would be much less conservative in the sense that you indicated. I mean, this is a man who has not had a well thought out political philosophy for most of his life. He came to politics late. I think the Democrats made a fatal mistake after the election. They were so stunned at his election that rather than do the smart thing, which is try to seduce him, because remember, they all knew him. I mean, he was Chuck Schumer's top donor a couple years as an individual. Instead of trying to seduce him, and Donald Trump craves attention and appropriate signs of respect, instead of doing that, they decided to launch the Russia probe, question his legitimacy, and attack him. That drove him into the arms of conservatives. I'll give you an anecdote. Ed Feulner was the head of at the Heritage Foundation, was head of the transition team for Trump. So it's December, the month before Donald Trump is inaugurated. He's only been elected a month, and they're watching television together, and the commentators are just completely dismissing Trump, saying he's worse than a buffoon, he's evil. And Donald Trump Jr. is watching the show with Ed Feulner, and he turns to Ed and says, Ed, we grew up in New York. In New York, everyone's a Democrat. We were Democrats. We played the political game. We hobnobbed with Democrats. But now look what they're doing to us. They're turning our family into some kind of, mafia crime family almost. I guess we're conservatives now. So it's a strange path, but I think the Democrats in part drove Donald Trump into the arms of the conservatives. And even though many conservatives are still uncomfortable with Trump's style, his approach, and frankly the lying, because Donald Trump and the truth are often strangers. The thing that saves him is the same thing can be said of his critics. So I think that Trump is a conservative. He's not the kind of conservative we're used to.
Thank you. Little bit zeroing in on the midterms and the results as well. We heard that Democrats are at least in the open. They are quite enthusiastic about the results, especially concerning the House. While we also read President Trump's tweet just after the results came out, basically saying that these are wonderful results for the Republicans. So who won? Who won on this midterm? And what's the main takeaway for Republicans and also for Democrats, also looking ahead for the next 2 years?
Well, speaking less than seriously, I will say, now that the election is over, the American people have won because the campaigning is over. Our campaigns last a long time. In fact, I think there's a class of political consultants and journalists in America who've decided that they really like their full-time jobs, so they make the campaign never go away. The campaign is permanent now in America. And it's also become a reality TV show, and therefore it has to get higher and higher ratings. So our politics is changing. The values of entertainment are trumping the values of policy. All sides can take away something. I think that the two things I would pinpoint are this. This is the first campaign in my living memory where the media and the establishment did not complain that there was too much money in politics. It was just not an issue. Not an issue. And that's because the Democrats outspent the Republicans for the first time by 3-1. And the biggest Democratic contributors were people like Michael Bloomberg, who has a media empire, and Tom Steyer out of California, who is a big alternative energy guru, and various other people who have friends in the media or own media outlets. And they decided to spend enormous amounts of money to defeat Trump's candidates and to promote their own, and somehow that was fine. So they seem to be the big winners. Money is back in politics, and it's not a bad thing until the next time the Republicans outspend the Democrats. Then it will be a bad thing. The other winner, I think, will be, I think Donald Trump has less reason to fear a challenge in the Republican primary than ever before. That's not so much a result of the election as it is about Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation battle, because that united all strands of the Republican Party, not behind Trump, but against the left. And even my former colleague Bret Stephens, who is now at the New York Times, he actually wrote a column saying, I'm grateful for Donald Trump, and he said it, I'm grateful 6 times, because he said he's a bully, but at least he's standing up to the bigger bullies who are trying to destroy Brett Kavanaugh's career and derail a Supreme Court appointment on very flimsy grounds. The Democrats won about 35 seats in the House. That's only 3 more than the average of a president in the first midterm election after he was elected. The Senate was an anomalous map. It was not a common map, but the Republicans did gain seats. It will be easier for them to approve a future Supreme Court nomination or cabinet officials or judges. Governors, the Republicans still hold a majority of the governorships, although they lost some big states like Illinois and Michigan. They retained states like Florida and Arizona that are very large. So in general, it's a mixed bag that tilted to the Democrats, but it was expected that the midterm election is almost always a referendum on the party in power, and it's almost always a partial repudiation of the party in power because people will find something to be dissatisfied with.
Before turning to the audience, I would have one more question in connection to the results of the election. So, what will be on the agenda for President Trump for the next 2 years? We know that usually foreign policy takes greater space within this cycle, within a presidential cycle after the midterms. But will it be that way now with the House Democratic majority? And also, will President Donald Trump be able to energize his base, focusing more on foreign policy issues, or this is I'm completely wrong, and he will continue to push on a domestic agenda, for instance, tax reforms, or maybe healthcare, or whatever you might suggest?
I think most of what Donald Trump will be occupied with is total war. Total war with Speaker Nancy Pelosi, total war with the Democrats in the Senate, total war with the media, which is, I guess, the opposition party in his view. Domestically, there will be almost nothing done except maybe a little bit on building roads and transit systems. In foreign policy, where presidents generally get to go if they're blocked on domestic issues, Donald Trump will continue to crack down on Iran, China, and North Korea. We can discuss in the question and answer period if anyone has specifics on those. But those issues, if the country is at peace, largely, with the exception of proxy wars in Afghanistan and elsewhere, with the exception of those, if the country is at peace, people tend not to vote on foreign policy. It is not true that only a minority of Americans own a passport. It's actually about 62%, but the vast majority of Americans don't use their passport that much because we're a continental nation that stretches 4,500 kilometers from one end to the other. I think that people are going to be voting on 2 things in 2020. Is the economy still strong? And is Donald Trump still as controversial and still infuriating his opposition as much as he is now.
Thank you. And with this, I would open the floor for questions from the audience. So I would like to ask to please shortly just identify yourself and pose a question. So
Our lovely
there was
intern
one
will carry along the mic.
in the back, please.
Thank you. István Szabadföldi from Hungarian Republican Society. I have one question. Would you comment Mike Pence's speech at Hudson Institute regarding the China relation and the whole China question?
Well, if populism's rise is due in part to the failure of elites, it's pretty hard to come up with a more spectacular failure than the elite decision in 2002 to admit China to the World Trade Organization with very few guarantees that they would be operating as a normal capitalist country. The theory in 2002 was that if you let China into the family of nations, they will not only behave, but they will gradually evolve into something approaching a liberal democracy over time. Wrong. I was wrong too. I didn't believe it quite as much as the elites did, but I was wrong as well. China has developed a new ideology, not seen, with the possible exception of certain movements with armbands in the 1930s in Europe. I call it an improved version of the corporate state or fascism, where you meld the economy to the needs of the government. And while the economy can prosper, it must do so following the dictates of the government. I call this system market Leninism. Market Leninism. And it raises challenges because China does have ambitions on the world stage, including military ambitions. I'm not so pessimistic as to think that China is going to become the new generator of a Cold War between the West and them, but I think that, let's face it, George W. Bush, Barack Obama both dodged the China problem. They left it for someone else. Donald Trump has had mixed results so far with China, but he's decided to address this issue. This is one area where, unlike entitlements, he's decided not to kick the can down the road. I don't always agree with him on the methods or the approach, but I'm glad that Pence spoke out the way he did, that China is a serious, ongoing threat. And if you don't believe me, look at all the African countries that have lately been kicking the Chinese out, because the Chinese were about to buy up all their resources and subjugate them with a new form of colonialism. Not military colonialism, but resource colonialism. And that's worth a whole other discussion. We probably should go on to other questions, though.
Thank you. Any new questions from the audience? First here, please. First here, please, in the front row.
Tom Howells, I'm a local venture capitalist. Just a question of detail, because it interests me, but Mr. Fund used the word liberal a number of times to describe... No, it's... Yeah, okay, and equally, Dr. Varga used the word liberal, and I think you had different things in mind. And when did this transition happen from liberal being what all free-thinking, free-born Englishmen think in 1790 to become a term, a badge used by both sides very strongly to mean something completely different?
The theft of the word liberalism by those who are not liberal. There are many theories as to how this came about. I think there are many fathers of this theft. If I had a preference for the most pernicious, it would be a British writer named T.H. Green. Does that name ring a bell? Yes, he was one of the early Fabians. They stole the term, and the basic problem in late Victorian and early Edwardian England was the progressives, the collectivists of their era, had to decide. They wanted to keep the idealism of liberalism, but they wanted to change the definition to suit their need for social controls and political power and control of the economy. So the initial liberalism was, we want people to be free, to be at liberty, to basically have economic opportunity so they could improve their life and a lot of their families. To be free. Freedom from government coercion, freedom from artificially imposed constraints like state religions, things like that. The new liberals, the ones who stole the word, decided that they, in the words of Franklin Roosevelt, had to have freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from impoverishment, freedom from the normal constraints of scarcity. And they did a pretty good job. So liberalism, in a watered down form, still has some of the elements of that in Britain, more so on the continent, where parties still call themselves liberal, like the Free Democrats in Germany and other places. But in America, it basically captured the word. So that's why you'll notice I use the term classical liberal. It's a clunky word. I wouldn't use it if I were giving a political speech, but you're a sophisticated group, so I thought I'd try it out on you.
Thank you. There was a question here from the second row.
Thank you. I'm George Tucker, a PhD student, and you mentioned the name of William Buckley and Russell Kirk and all the great, let's say, paleoconservatives of the United States. What do you think the present Republican decision makers, so do they share this kind of classical conservative in terms of culture, especially values of the great tradition, or they also face some kind of identity or value crisis, just like the left or the Democrats?
Wow, that's profound. You just, short of 20 minutes, I don't know if I can address that. Wow. Okay, I'll oversimplify. Are you speaking of Republican politicians, elected officials? I was afraid of that. Look, I'm going to oversimplify and be unfair, but it will communicate a basic idea. I see Michael Gonzalez grinning. He knows what I'm about to say. There are many reasons why I never ran for political office, because the incentive structure is all wrong if you believe in ideas. Politicians want to get reelected. Now, many of my best friends are politicians. Don't get me wrong. If I were one, I'd suffer the same incentive structure and temptations as they do. I don't want to put myself better than them or put myself on a pedestal. But I'm going to describe the beast. 10% of people in Congress, both left and right, really, really believe in either liberalism or conservatism. 10% on either side. So that leaves 80% in the middle. Now, those people have preferences, and that's why they gravitated to one political party rather than the other, and the parties are doing a sorting out ideologically. You know, it used to be you were Republican or Democrat depending on, you know, what flag your state followed in something called the Civil War. So that used to be an explanation. Now they're sorted out on broad ideological grounds, so the choice is clear, and that's a good thing. There are many fewer conservative Democrats now and many fewer liberal Republicans. But having said that, the political imperatives to get elected and to avoid political pain and to search for people who are politically popular and attach yourself to them is very acute. So there are lots of Reagan Republicans in office, but now Donald Trump is president. And you have to deal with the reality today, not the reality you wanted that was or the reality you would like to be. The same thing with the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party has moved far left. Medicare for all was not something that Bill Clinton or Barack Obama ever talked about, ever. Getting rid of ICE, the Border Patrol, that wasn't something that was even contemplated in serious circles a few years ago. But now we have people running for president saying, abolish ICE, the Border Patrol. So I think in both parties, you have conflicting incentive structures. In the age of Trump, the Democratic activists who have a disproportionate say in the primaries and in the party structure have decided, well, whenever we listen to the establishment, they sell us out and we lose. Hillary Clinton was the establishment candidate, and we all know the Clintons were closet moderates from our point of view. So why are we listening to the establishment again? We're going hard left. And they will go through the election results, and even though most of the hard left candidates lost in the midterm election, they will find the few that did and promote them. So the establishment in the Democratic Party discredited itself with its activists, and the establishment in the Republican Party discredited itself with Mitt Romney's loss and with the perceived failure to overturn Obamacare, even though that was a much less realistic goal than they pretended it was. The establishments have discredited themselves. So you end up with a very short-term thinking. What will get us elected? And part of the problem in our politics today is our government has gotten so big and so unwieldy, and there's so much political power at stake that we've now politicized our Supreme Court completely. We used to want people on the court who actually would be judges, look at things relatively dispassionately. Now it's become almost like an election by another means. And the electorate is now the Senate, and it's treated like a gladiator contest. So I'm not saying there was ever a golden age of ideas among elected Republicans or elected Democrats, but ideas are much more short-term in their implementation now than they used to be.
Thank you. Here, maybe first there, sorry, and then after.
Thank you. I'm Anders Dicani, a retired ambassador. You made a brief reference. Geneva, UN. You made a brief reference to the Four Freedoms speech, which is freedom of worship, freedom of speech, freedom from fear, and freedom from want, and freedom for fear. And I'm not quite convinced that if you put these four freedoms before the US Congress, there would be a unanimous vote for it. Not least that there would be a unanimous vote for it. I mean, for the first two. I'm not quite sure about it. I know. I'm just, as I was listening to your philosophical explanation, it came to my mind that the American public, the American voter, they didn't think about the National Review or other very interesting and very good papers or newspapers or ideas or conservatism or whatever. They were thinking about their own life experiences when they made their choices how to vote and where to vote.
I think I indicated that in my
So, and given that fact, what do you think? Why the Republican Party lost 25 seats in the House? What happened to those? Because I was not surprised that the Senate was kept more or less in Republican hands, but the House was lost. So what's your take on that loss, given the fact that maybe when they will elect the new chairman of the important commissions, they will issue subpoenas after subpoenas, as you made a reference to it. Thank you.
It may be my fault, but I think I addressed that already, but I'll repeat it maybe in different words. The average political party loses 32 seats in the House in every midterm election, the first after a president is elected. The 35 seats the Republicans lost is roughly in that average range. I think there were clear factors contributing to that. One was Trump's personality and style rub a lot of people the wrong way. A lot of people, including suburban women in key districts. There were 25 districts that had elected a Republican congressman in 2016, but also voted for Hillary Clinton. Republicans lost most of those seats. Secondly, there was a much larger than normal turnout in a midterm election because I think the opposition to Trump was more intense than the support of Trump. And, you know, hate is a bigger motivator than love, I hate to tell you, in politics. I just hate to tell you that. I think Hungarians know something of that in their history as well. So I don't think it was an extraordinary outcome, which I take it as part of your question. I do think there were contributing factors, and I think Donald Trump even said at the end of the campaign, if I had made a mistake the last 2 years, it was my tone. Now, I don't know if Donald Trump has a long history of learning from mistakes. It takes some years to even acknowledge he ever made one. So I'm not sure how much the tone will change. But I think it will change a little bit because he really, really wants to win re-election. And I think he will run for re-election. So I think the tone will be a bit better. And then you have the anti-Trump people were running against sort of the idea of Trump without actually running against a real candidate. Similarly, in 2020, Trump will be running against an actual live human Democrat who will have his own or her own set of liabilities. And some of the Democratic candidates present opportunities for Trump. Several of them, like Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris or Cory Booker, they're so left-wing that their left hand doesn't know what their extreme left hand is doing. That's how left-wing they are. And, you know, I'd say Donald Trump has a 50-50 chance for re-election. If he does win re-election, I think the odds are the Republicans will take back the House because they only have to win about 10 seats, 12 seats to get back the House. And the Senate, I think the Democrats will gain a couple seats because the map is more favorable to them, but they're unlikely to get a majority. So once again, as we're learning currently in the Florida recounts, American elections are now traditionally, the new tradition is they're very close, and a few votes make a difference, which is why the sound and fury is even greater than ever before, because there are fewer and fewer people in the middle that can tilt the election one way or the other. Oh, yes, I forgot that. That's a very good point. I think the Republicans had 42 people leave their ranks in the House. Since they had about 240 seats, that means almost 20% of House Republicans retired. Now, in districts where that was safe, it didn't matter. But there were a lot of districts where when you don't have an incumbent, people take a look at a new face, a new party. And they lost a lot of those retirement seats. So that was another unusual factor. One of the reasons why people tend to retire is Congress is not a fun job anymore. It's not a fun job. A few years ago, a magazine published an article it was a congressman named John Hyler, and a reporter followed him around for 2 weeks and just figured out what his life was like. And I think the headline of the article was "The Unbearable Torment of Being John Hyler." And look, if someone offered me, okay, the Senate seat is different, but if someone offered me a seat in the House of Representatives, I probably wouldn't take it. Comes with 20 employees, a good salary, people laugh at your jokes. I mean, you know, but it's not worth it. It's an awful job, and it's driving people. You know, there's a Gresham's law of money. Bad money drives out good money. Well, in our politics in America, you know, the election of more bad people is driving out good people. So,
John, thanks. Steve Pearson. I look back at the progression of elections and how they take place, going back to the presidential election 2 years ago and the midterms this year, and it seems both parties, all they want to do is go to each side of the room with no real concept of middle ground. It used to be people, when they were elected, would work together and try to compromise. Now I think compromise is out of the question, is seen as weakness by those who elect people. Is there any hope of some sort of reaching across the aisle, or is that all just verbiage from the politicians?
No, next question. No, to be serious, I'm gonna challenge the conventional wisdom a little here. And what I'm about to say, I believe about 80% of it, and the rest is oversimplification to make the point more sharp. The kind of compromise we had in the golden age of compromise, the 1950s, the 1960s, and the 1970s, was pretty easy to establish because there was a general consensus in America behind the containment strategy of the Cold War, which dictated our foreign policy, and the gradual expansion of government. Gradual. Some wanting to do it more quickly and some wanting to do it less quickly. But the Republican approach to legislation expanding government was, we'll make it more efficient and do it for half the price. And that's easy to have compromise at that point because you're debating around the details. But whether or not to have Medicare for all, which is national health insurance, single payer, that's an on or off switch. I mean, that's a fundamental decision. It changes a culture. Ask Britain or Canada how much having national health insurance changed their culture and the attitude of the people towards government. We're now in a stage where the debates are not just whether to expand government, but whether to shrink government. For example, through the deregulation efforts that Trump has launched. That goes against the grain of the media establishment. Does anyone here believe that more than 5% of journalists voted for Donald Trump? Is there anyone who actually believes more than 5% voted for Donald Trump? No, of course not. I don't vote for president. I haven't for 35 years. I don't believe in voting for president because I cover the president, and I don't want to make that investment, that psychic investment in the decision. So I didn't vote for Donald Trump. I certainly wouldn't have voted for Hillary Clinton, who is an instrument of evil. And we can go into that. But, what really drives me crazy is that compromise is always supposed to be towards a certain end, which is to expand government and, frankly, have a less assertive foreign policy on behalf of American interests. Our foreign policy establishment, basically their foreign policy critique is pretty simple. Look at Bosnia under Clinton, look at Libya under Obama. If a military intervention is ever done under a liberal president, it's only done for supposedly humanitarian reasons where the direct interests of the United States are not at stake. If the interests of the United States strategically or tactically are really at stake, we're not supposed to have a war. That also goes for the Iraq War of George W. Bush, where I don't think our national immediate strategic and tactical issues were front and center. So now that Donald Trump has decided to assert the fact that we should have America first, that is a break from the liberal establishment's foreign policy views. And even though Trump does not have a fully formed view of this, boy, does it anger the beast. And so I agree with you, compromise is harder, but one of the reasons it's harder is we're debating not just how fast we expand government, but we're actually debating whether we should cut it or expand it. And that's a much harder playing field to have compromise on. So that's why you go to your respective corners, because it's A or B, not or all. A light switch does not go in the middle. Not a dimmer is not something that normally is found in Congress.
Well, John, I got to tell you, I really hated your speech because it's a lot better than the one I gave 2.5 hours ago.
But you had just landed. Now, I expect you to give a good speech tomorrow morning after you've had a good night's sleep.
But I want to congratulate. Sit down.
Yes, just tell us who you are and what order.
I'm Mike Gonzalez for the Heritage Foundation, and I want to congratulate you, Melissa. You really have gotten one of the best political minds in the country. I remember in the year 2000, as I was headed into French TV to analyze the 2000 election, it was like at the gallows. I said, do I have time to make one phone call? I said, yes. I called John. I said, John, I'm
The
in
lifeline.
Paris. What do I say? And you said, look at Pennsylvania, look at Florida. So you were prophetic, not about Pennsylvania, but about Florida you were. It's very simple. Of the likely Democratic candidates,
All 30 of them?
who is the most likely not to defeat Donald Trump, but to who would do the best against Donald Trump in 2020?
Oh, that I don't know. I can tell you who probably will get the Democratic nomination, though. I think it will be Kamala Harris of California. Kamala Harris, I mean, she's from California. California has over 20% of the delegates needed to win a Democratic presidential nomination. California alone has over 20%. She's African ancestry and Indian subcontinent ancestry. She's both. Indians are the wealthiest community in America, the wealthiest, not just the wealthiest immigrant community, the wealthiest community in America. And she will raise money like nobody's business, more so than even Bobby Jindal or Nikki Haley could do, because Indians still lean Democratic. She is moving as far left as she possibly can. She's a woman. Women have advantages running for the Democratic nomination. A lot of women feel that Hillary, was the chance to be the first female president. She didn't turn out well, but it's time to break that glass ceiling. So I don't know how well she'll do, but I think if I had to guess, it'll be Trump versus Kamala Harris.
Hello, I'm Dave LeClaire. I'm a deplorable American.
A proud deplorable?
Yes, a proud deplorable. So you addressed it in several times, the hypocrisy of a lot of the elite, which as a deplorable is what I deplore above anything else. And a little story, myself, I feel a little bit trapped. Like all Americans, I did the genetic testing with my family. My wife is Venezuelan. The children tested to have 1% African American, or not African American, but Central African heritage, which is very common, of course. They're getting ready to apply for college. Can they apply as a black to college? Is that what the world we're headed to? And it's not, if it's a sensitive topic, you don't need to address it.
It's not sensitive at all. I mean, what colleges do you want your kids to go to?
Yeah, well, that's
You tell me what colleges you want your kids to go to.
Well, they would like to go to a University of California. They would like to go to Notre Dame, something like that. So, of course, they've had every advantage in life. We live overseas. We have, send them to the American school.
Well, without asking a too personal a question, so 1% Central African, what are the other elements in their background?
50% Hispanic.
Well, I think you go for twofer.
Yeah, and of course the question is:
Are your children male or female?
Both.
Look.
Yes. I'm letting them. Don't we define it ourselves today? That's the one and two.
I think we have reached the point now of almost no return. On the one hand, everyone is interested in blood quantum. Does anyone know what blood quantum was? Blood quantum was the theory in the Jim Crow South. One drop of African American blood marked you to be part of the wrong side of the color line. One drop. I mean, the guy who was thrown off the streetcar in Plessy versus Ferguson was like 90% white. but he was thrown off the streetcar. We're all fixated on blood quantum now. So everybody takes it seriously, but no one takes it seriously at the same time, because Elizabeth Warren, I mean, is there anything more ridiculous than what Elizabeth Warren did? I mean, I am 1/1000th American Indian, so I was correct in stating I was American Indian on checking the box. So look, part of me says you shouldn't check any box, you should rebel, but you know, we live in a practical world, and I don't think, I mean, your children can make up, if your children are going to college, they can make up their own mind, but I would not encourage them to shortchange their educational future lightly. I think you should lay it out for them. I think, and if I were you, I would recommend, you know, this is a game, and I didn't create the rules of the game, but I don't think you should withdraw from the game just because it's a, you know, if we withdrew from every fixed game in life, we wouldn't be players. So I do remember this, that I remember in San Francisco, where I grew up, there was a guy who wanted to be a deputy chief of fire department. And so he was completely qualified. But it turned out that he had mixed Italian and Hispanic heritage. So he always went to the Christopher Columbus parades. He was proud Italian. I'm sure the DNA would demonstrate that. But Italians are too successful in America. They've been here for 3 or 4 generations, so that didn't cut the mustard. So he didn't get the job. So the next time a deputy chief of fire department chief job came up, he went to every Cinco de Mayo celebration and checked the Hispanic box and got the job. Then he made the mistake of starting to go back to Christopher Columbus parades. That's a long story what happened to him. The other story is, does anyone know where the island of Montserrat is? It's in the Caribbean. Well, the first settlers there was nobody on this rock, and I mean nobody on this rock in 1494 when a bunch of Irish castaways showed up, many of whom were red-haired. And they established themselves. As far as they could tell, they were the first inhabitants of the island of Montserrat. Later, during slavery, they obviously brought some Africans over involuntarily, and you know, the island today is mixed. But there's still a large white population there, and many of them trace their roots back to the Irish. So there was this red-haired, blue-eyed Irish guy in Boston who wanted to be a police captain. And he had been born on the island of Montserrat. And then the family had moved to Boston to be with even more Irish. So there's this list. And it says, what are you? And there's this list that says Caribbean. So he said, well, that's where I was born. That's where I was from. The original inhabitants were Irish. I'm a Caribbean. He not only lost his original job at the police department, he was sued for misrepresenting himself. It went to court, and the judge said, well, I mean, I know why people are mad at you, because you're not black, but it sounds to me like your family's been there since 1494. They're the original inhabitants. It's in the Caribbean. What's to argue with? So, I mean, but the point of telling these stories are, down this road lies madness. And I find it fascinating that every year we celebrate Martin Luther King. And Martin Luther King was an historic figure. We have a holiday after him. He was so important. And the one thing we're not allowed to repeat anymore, because now it's politically incorrect, is what is Martin Luther King, formerly, what was he most famous for saying? I live for the day when my children will be judged not by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. To the extent we've moved away from that ideal, we have lost much of what is America and much of what makes America and exceptionalism important. And to the extent that we adopt this identity politics, we are adopting the very worst of what our ancestors fled from in Europe and other parts of the world, which is you are defined by how you were born, what clan you were born into, what tribe you were born into, how you look. I I'm in favor of responsible nationalism and patriotism and ethnic pride and all of those things. But to the extent we start going back to what our ancestors fled, we're abandoning America for some strange territory I don't want to be a part of.
Coming close to our panel, I would have one last question. You have mentioned Europe now in your concluding remarks. What are the implications of the past 2 years of American conservatism and populism, and also Trump's presidency? Are there implications for European conservatives and also for some of the populist movements in Europe, and also looking to Hungary as well going forward?
Well, yesterday, as you know, was the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I, and President Macron took that opportunity in France to blast nationalism. I guess that's the new deplorable term. And he said we can no longer count on the United States as a reliable partner. Well, you know, a certain dose of reality I don't think is a bad thing. And the fact of the matter is, unless Vladimir Putin is a whole lot stronger than I think he is, and unless radical Islam has a whole lot more staying power than I think it does, the greatest existential threat that Europe faces is itself. Has it lost any sense of optimism, future-oriented thinking, desire to have children and raise them, have a vibrant entrepreneurial economy? I think the major existential threats that Europe faces are within, not without. And the United States can't help with that. No matter how much we subsidize NATO, that's not going to make your decision any easier over the challenges that you have. And if Donald Trump is the vehicle by which Europe basically decides, you know, we're still going to be friends, but we're not going to be married to each other, that's not a bad thing. It's a dose of realism. It's inevitable that if you don't have an immediate threat, fascism or communism, or, you know, Kaiserism, it's understandable that you're going to have some distance because you start to get wrapped up in your own concerns. So it's not a bad thing. It means Europe has had peace and prosperity largely since 1945, since 1989 when Eastern Europe was liberated and Hungary was liberated. So for American conservatives, I lived much of my childhood in Europe. I have European relatives in 3 different countries. I come back a great deal. I love Europe. But to the extent that Europe makes its own decisions as a body or as an individual country, get on with that job and cooperate with the United States, trade with the United States, have exchanges with the United States, which are easier and cheaper than ever to maintain, go to school in the United States, have Americans come to Europe. You know, the thing about the elites that we always see on television going to these meetings and shaking their hands, and I'll conclude with this is on a level that doesn't affect most people. Look, the average American or the average European gets up in the morning and much of their day is involved in forgetting about politics and getting on with the serious business of living. They don't spend their day obsessed with what the next ministerial meeting is going to decide in Brussels or anywhere. They're interested in their home, their family, their job, their hobbies, for many their faith. They're interested about getting on with the serious business of living day to day and the challenges that brings. in an increasingly difficult world with lots of temptations. Politics, for most people, most of the time, is every 4 years a bunch of people start yelling at you on television and putting up posters and saying it's your patriotic duty to vote for candidate A or candidate B or party A or party B, and you do it and you move on then to the serious business of living. And I think that America and Europe would be healthier if the average person decided politics should be relevant again, because I'm going to demand that politicians start speaking to my daily concerns and not some concerns about having a new European army to God knows do what, or to micromanage the asylum policy of a relatively small country of 10 million in the middle of Europe, which should make its own decisions about that. I mean, get on with it. The problem is not so much that the elites and the average person have different perspectives on life. They have completely different interests. I live in the political arena. I like the political arena. I mean, I'm part of these elites. But I do have some sense of perspective, which is I'm in politics because I want to make politics less important in people's lives, not more important. The elites I'm fighting against are the ones who want to make politics everything in people's lives. Down that path does not lie a prosperous country you'd want to raise your family in. End of story. And that's the decision that Europe has to make. How politicized a society should you have? Macron is convinced that nationalism is the greatest threat to Europe. Well, I'm not saying it's not a danger potentially. The bigger danger is everything is politicized in Europe, and its headquarters is Brussels.
Thank you very much. With that, I would give the floor to...
Well, we've had an excellent conversation here. Dr. Vaga, thank you so much. John Fund, thank you so much. And now if you'll all join us for refreshments in the back. Thank you.